Hey everyone, in our time together, we're going to be looking at how Isaiah 24 and 25 relates to Revelation chapters 19 and 20, particularly when it comes to the idea of a future earthly kingdom of Jesus the Messiah after his second coming. Now, a lot of people already know that Revelation 19 and 20 get a lot of attention because it does discuss the second coming of Jesus and Jesus's millennial kingdom, but it's not often known that there actually is a precursor text in the Old Testament that actually is somewhat of a forerunner of the millennial kingdom idea that we see in Revelation 19 and 20. Now, you may know already that in the book of Revelation, there are all kinds of allusions to the Old Testament. So, Revelation is very heavily reliant upon concepts and ideas that are found in the Old Testament. And when it comes to the return of the Messiah with the kingdom, with a two-stage judgment of enemies, that is taught in Isaiah 24 and 25. So the title of this message is Isaiah 24 and 25, the book of Revelation and the millennium. Now, the thesis of our message is this: Isaiah 24 and 25 predicts prophetic conditions similar to that found in the book of Revelation and is a forerunner of the millennial kingdom idea found in Revelation chapters 19 and 20. Now, as we turn our attention to the Isaiah passage, Isaiah 24 and 25 come in the context of Isaiah 24 through 27, which is referred to as Isaiah's little apocalypse. And some have noted that what is happening in these chapters is somewhat of a culmination of what was being discussed in the earlier section of Isaiah chapter 13 through 23, where there were all kinds of prophecies given concerning Gentile nations, people groups, and cities. So what we are seeing in Isaiah 24 to 27, it involves the nation of Israel, but there are also great implications on a global scale for nations. And many have noted that what occurs in Isaiah 24 and 27 is like a miniature book of Revelation, because a lot of the ideas that we see in this section of Isaiah have a counterpart in the book of Revelation. For example, the book of Revelation has a lot to say about the day of the Lord. So too does Isaiah 24. When it comes to the return of the Lord, that is something that is discussed in Isaiah's little apocalypse. In Isaiah 24, particularly towards the end of the chapter, there's going to be discussion of a two-stage judgment of enemies, which you also see in the book of Revelation. And of course, there is a kingdom that is discussed in Isaiah 25, which would have parallels to what is taking place in Revelation chapter 20. Now, we will actually look at Isaiah 24 and 25 here in a moment, but just to note the outline here that we're going from, when it comes to Isaiah chapter 24, verses 1 to 20, there is discussion of a global day of the Lord judgment. In chapter 24, verses 21 to 22, there will be discussion of punishment of kings of the earth and then evil spiritual beings. And then in verse 23 of chapter 24, there will be mention of the Lord reigning from Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And then when you get to Isaiah chapter 25, that's where you have discussion of a kingdom and a kingdom celebration with banquet. Now, as we go through Isaiah 24 and 25, we're not doing a full exegesis or explanation of every verse, but we are noting the flow of what is being described. In the first few verses of Isaiah 24, we see why there is going to be a global day of the Lord. Behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the servant like his master, the maid like her mistress, et cetera, et cetera. Where it's saying this global catastrophe is going to hit everybody, no matter what their social status. We're told in verse 3 that the earth will be completely laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. The earth mourns and withers, the world fades and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth fade away. The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they transgressed laws, violated statutes, broke the everlasting covenant. Therefore, a curse devours the earth, and those who live in it are held guilty. Therefore, the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men are left. So you see the reason why there is this coming global catastrophe that's going to hit the entire planet, people, and the earth itself is because of sin. It's because of sin and man's disobedience against God that there is a coming day of reckoning. Now, the words day of the Lord are not specifically mentioned here like they would be in Isaiah 13 or other sections of the Old Testament that talk about the day of the Lord concept. There's little doubt that what is being described here is very consistent with the global day of the Lord idea. And many of the things you see here would also be found in the book of Revelation from chapter 6 through 18. Now, I'm not going to read everything that follows here, but you have a poetic, figurative description of the judgment that is going to come. For example, in verse 7, the new wine mourns, the vine decays, all the merry-hearted sigh, the gaiety of tambourines ceases, the noise of revelers stops, the gaiety of the harp ceases, they do not drink wine with song. Strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. The city of chaos is broken down. Every house is shut up so that none may enter. We see in verse 11 that all joy turns to gloom. The gaiety of the earth is banished. This is a time where nobody is happy, nobody is joyful, nobody is celebrating. Verse 12 says, desolation is left in the city and the gate is battered to ruins. Now, when you jump down a little bit, you see other things indicating how terrible this situation is. Verse 17 says, terror and pit and snare confront you, O inhabitant of the earth. Then it will be that he who flees the report of disaster will fall into the pit. He who climbs out of the pit will be caught in the snare, for the windows above are open and the foundations of the earth shake. And then notice the incredible earthquakes here, which you obviously see in the book of Revelation mentioned. The earth is broken asunder, the earth is split through, the earth is shaken violently. The earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, and it totters like a shack, for its transgression is heavy upon it, and it will fall never to rise again. So you see a lot of this calamity that's hitting everybody at this time. Now, we personally feel that this is part of that coming day of the Lord that's also talked about in passages like 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and 2 Peter chapter 3, in which we believe is described in Revelation chapter 6 through 18. So you have a great description of a global calamitous day of the Lord that is hitting all people who are on the earth at this particular time. And then when you get to verse 21, there's some interesting developments that take place as this day of the Lord has been unfolding. We're told in verse 21 that so it will happen in that day, again, we think that day is the day of the Lord, that the Lord will, notice he will punish the host of heaven on high. So that refers to evil spirit beings. So the host of heaven on high would be evil beings that are not humans, but humans are also involved because we're also told in verse 21, and the kings of the earth on earth. Now, when you get to the end of Revelation 19, there's discussion of the kings of the earth and their armies. So there's a direct reference to this verse in Revelation chapter 19. But notice that there's going to be a punishing of evil spirit beings, the host of heaven on high, and the kings of the earth on earth. So that involves the nations and then the kings of the nations that are opposed to God. Now, when you come to verse 22, things get even more interesting here because we're told they will be gathered together like prisoners in the dungeon and will be confined in prison. So there is an incarceration that takes place. They become prisoners. They're personally confined. This is linked with the dungeon and being confined in prison, as we will see when you get to Revelation chapter 20. When it comes to Satan in the demonic realm, there ends up being a personal imprisonment, binding of Satan, and then he's thrown into the abyss, which is a prison. So again, we see how similar this is to the idea that we will see in Revelation 19 and 20. And then also very interesting at the end of verse 22, and after many days, they will be punished. So notice there's a two-stage judgment or punishment coming. So when it comes to the evil spiritual forces and the kings of the earth and the evil human beings, they're gathered together like prisoners in the dungeon and confined in prison. But it doesn't end there. That's the first phase of what happens to these evil forces. And then we're told, and after many days, let that sink in. And after many days, they will be punished. So there's a punishment coming that is distinct from being confined in prison. And we are going to point out that's what you will see in the case of Satan when you get to Revelation chapter 20, where he will be bound and imprisoned in a place called the abyss. And then there will be 1,000-year kingdom. Then after that, he is released for a short time and then punished in the lake of fire. So we do want to note that the concept of a two-stage judgment that we see in Revelation 20 is also found in Isaiah 24. Now, we're also told in verse 23 that then the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed. For the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. So when it comes to this coming day of the Lord and then the judgment of the enemies of God, there's also the Lord of hosts reigning on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. And that's consistent with many passages in the Bible talking about Messiah's kingdom being a kingdom reign from the earth. So we get not only the punishment of evil forces, but also the Lord reigning on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. That would be literally the city of Jerusalem when this kingdom takes place. The first few verses of chapter 25 are like a psalm. Oh Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will give thanks to your name. I'm not going to read the next few verses, but it's basically a psalm of praise for what God is doing. And then when you get to verses 6 and following, you see this kingdom celebration banquet. Now, there's a celebration mentioned early that will be coming early in Revelation 19, I think in Matthew 8, verses 10 to 12 in that area. Jesus promised there would come a day where believers would be having a fellowship banquet with the patriarchs of Israel. And so there's a kingdom banquet, which we take quite literally. There's a celebration banquet, which would be a literal celebration with food and drink, but also represents the peace of the kingdom of this time. So we're told in verse 6 that the Lord of hosts will prepare a lavish banquet for all peoples on this mountain, a banquet of aged wine, choice pieces with marrow, and refined aged wine. So there was good food and drink in Messiah's kingdom. And on this mountain, he will swallow up the covering which is over all peoples, even the veil which is stretched over all nations. He will swallow up death for all time, and the Lord God will wipe tears away from all faces, and he will remove the reproach of his people from all the earth. For the Lord has spoken, and it will be said in that day, behold, this is our God for whom we have waited, that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us rejoice and be glad in his salvation. This verse 9 is one of my favorite verses, because when we are literally in the kingdom of the Messiah on earth, there's going to be a celebration, and we're celebrating everything that the Lord has done for us, not only dying for our sins and bringing us eternal life, but also to be on a restored planet and planet Earth where righteousness and justice are prevailing, the celebration banquet that's occurring at this particular time. So just to summarize the slide that we were looking at before we actually went into Isaiah 24 and 25. In Isaiah 24, 1 to 20, you have global day of the Lord judgment. Verses 21 to 22, punishment of kings of the earth and evil spirit beings. Verse 23, the Lord reigning from Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And then in chapter 25, a kingdom banquet celebration. Now, I wanted to briefly mention the outline of the book of Revelation. It's not our intent to go deeply into the book of Revelation because it's somewhat beyond our purposes, and we don't have the time to go through every chapter. But when you look at the book of Revelation, we do believe we are futurists when it comes to our understanding what's taking place from chapter 6 onward. You do have a global day of the Lord judgment that involves the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, Satan and the beast deception, the career of the city of Babylon and the fall of Babylon. Those are heavily influenced in chapter 6 to 18. We believe that period is tribulation, great tribulation, day of the Lord, also linked with the 70th week of Daniel. And then in chapter 19, particularly verses 11 and following, you have the second coming of Jesus with the defeat of armies and kings of the earth. And then in chapter 20, verses 1 to 3, Satan is said to be in prison for 1,000 years. And then in Revelation chapter 20, verse 4, in addition to resurrections that are taking place at that time, it also talks about a kingdom reign of Jesus and the saints for 1,000 years. And then in chapter 20, verses 7 to 10, Satan ends up being released for a short time after the 1,000 years, and then he's punished in the lake of fire. So we are making this point here so that we can show the comparison between Isaiah 24 and 25 and what's occurring in the book of Revelation. Now, just to make some parallels with the chronology of the book of Revelation, in chapters 6 through 18, you have the seals, trumpets, bowls, what's going on with Satan and the beast, the fall of Babylon, etc. And then when you get to chapter 19, which is the second coming of Jesus chapter, we are told in verse 9 that he said to me, right, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Now, we actually think that would have implications back to Isaiah 25 and the celebration supper or banquet that is being discussed. So as the second coming of Jesus and the kingdom are just on the horizon here, there's a reference to the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is a time of celebration. Now, when you get to verses 11 and following, this is where the second coming of Jesus is described. I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and wages war. His eyes are a flame of fire, et cetera, et cetera. We are told in verse 15 that when he comes, from his mouth comes a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations and he will rule them with a rod of iron. So Jesus is coming to defeat his enemies and to rule the nations. And as he does come to deal with the beast, who is much discussed in Revelation 13, and we believe is the Antichrist. And those, you also have that when Jesus comes, he deals with the kings of the earth and their armies. Remember, the kings of the earth were mentioned explicitly in the latter part of Isaiah chapter 24. And then as verses 20 and following come, the beast and the false prophet are dealt with at this particular time. So the enemies, the kings of the earth, the armies, the beast, the false prophet are dealt with. And then as you roll into chapter 20, again, remember there's no chapter divisions in the original writings. You actually see the ringleader of the enemies of God and of Christ being dealt with. When Jesus comes again, Revelation 19:11 following, he's dealing with the kings of the earth. He's dealing with the armies of the nations at this particular time. He deals with the Antichrist. He deals with the false prophet. And we also see that he deals with Satan at this particular time. Verse 1 says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven and holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years." So notice that he's bound for 1,000 years. And notice what this is linked with. He threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him so that he would not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years are completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. So we really want to note here, not only is there a binding of Satan, there's an incarceration with a placing in a spirit prison. That's what the abyss is. If you look at the references to abyss in the New Testament, they usually refer to a spirit prison for evil spirit beings. And so Satan is incarcerated at this particular time. And notice that as he's incarcerated, it's until the 1,000 years were completed. And then after these things, he must be released for a short time. Now, verse 4, as we mentioned earlier, we'll talk about the reign of Christ and the saints for 1,000 years. That talks about the 1,000-year reign of Christ after the day of the Lord, after his second coming. And then we are told in verses 7 and following that after the 1,000 years, Satan will be released for a short time. He will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, which again goes to show you that what's taking place with Jesus' millennial kingdom is taking place on earth, because when Satan is released, he rushes the earth, he rushes the holy city. Those who are in this rebellion, they came up, verse 9, they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, which is a reference to Jerusalem. So remember at the end of Isaiah 24, I think in verse 23, it talked about the Lord reigning from Jerusalem. So after the 1,000 years, there's a rush on the city of Jerusalem. And then we're told here that this is like an immediate destruction from God. Fire came down from heaven and devoured them. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire. So what you're seeing here is very similar to Isaiah 24, where there's an imprisonment taking place, in this case with Satan. Then you have 1,000 years, which would be very similar to the many days of Isaiah 24. And then Satan is punished in the lake of fire. Now let's make the direct comparison between Isaiah 24 and Revelation 19 and 20. Now, again, as we stated before, we believe that Isaiah 24, 1 to 20 is describing cosmic global day of the Lord that's still future from our standpoint. We believe Revelation chapter 6 to 18 is also describing a future global cataclysmic day of the Lord. But as we focus particularly here on verses 21 to 23, notice that what we have in verse 21b is there's going to be the punishment of the host of heaven above. And what do we see in Revelation 20, verse 2a? He sees the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. So evil spirit beings and being mentioned. Next, you have in Isaiah 24, 21c, the kings of the earth. And then notice the kings of the earth and their armies are mentioned in Revelation 19:19. In Isaiah 24, 22c, there's mention of being confined to a dungeon. And what do we see here in, this should be Revelation 20, verse 3. Notice that Satan was thrown into the abyss. So it threw him into the abyss, closed it, and put a seal on it. So that'd be very similar to being confined in a dungeon. Remember, the abyss is a spirit prison, which is a dungeon. Notice in Isaiah 24, 22d, after many days, and then in Revelation 20, verse 3, we're told until the 1,000 years were completed. And then in Isaiah 24, 22d, after many days, they will be punished. And then we're told in Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur. So when Isaiah talks about after many days of punishment in Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10, after many days would be comparable to the 1,000-year kingdom of the Messiah. And then there's a punishment of Satan in the lake of fire. So there are several similarities between Isaiah 24, 21 to 23 and what's occurring in Revelation 19 to 20. Just to show you this in chart form, there is a day of the Lord tribulation, which we think is Isaiah 24, 1 to 20, and then also described in Revelation 6 to 18. And then there ends up being an imprisonment of evil human and spirit beings, according to Isaiah 24, 22. Revelation 20, verses 2 to 3 talks about an imprisonment of Satan. And then when you come to the kingdom, we believe that's discussed in Isaiah 24, 23, Isaiah 25, verses 6 to 9, and then Revelation 20, verse 4. We believe that this kingdom would be part of that after many days that's mentioned in Isaiah 24, 22. Of course, in Revelation 20, verse 4, there's a 1,000-year reign of Christ that is mentioned. Isaiah 24, 23 talks about the Lord reigning from Zion, Jerusalem. There's also a kingdom banquet mentioned in chapter 25 of Isaiah, verses 6 to 9. And then notice when it comes to after the many days or after the 1,000 years, you have evil beings punished. Isaiah 24, 22b talks about that. And then in Revelation 20, verses 9 to 10, Satan is punished in the lake of fire. And thus, we believe that Isaiah 24 and 25 and the book of Revelation both teach what we call premillennialism, which is the belief that there is a future coming day of the Lord, which will be closely associated with the return of the Messiah to earth and to Jerusalem, which will then involve a two-stage judgment of God's enemies. And just to summarize this here, with both of these texts, there's a coming global day of the Lord. There is a coming judgment of evil human and spirit beings. There's a coming two-stage judgment punishment separated by many days or 1,000 years. And then there's also a coming kingdom reign of the Lord from Jerusalem. And then Revelation comes along and tells us how long the many days is, which is 1,000 years. So we want to be clear, Isaiah 24 is not explicitly mentioning 1,000 years, but it does talk about many days that separate the confinement of enemies of God and then eventually their punishment. So although we're not told how long the many days is, it seems like in the book of Revelation in chapter 20, we're told that the many days would be 1,000 years. I'm not the only one who is seeing this connection between the millennial kingdom after the second coming of Jesus of Revelation 19 and 20 and its comparisons with Isaiah 24 and 25. In his commentary on Isaiah, Grogan wrote that Isaiah 24, 22, quote, harmonizes with a premillennial interpretation of Revelation. And then Craig Blazing has also noticed when he's looked at these texts, quote, the many days of imprisonment between the coming of God in the day of the Lord and the punishment after which the Lord reigns in glory, greater than sun or moon, bear a correspondence to the millennial period in Revelation 20, which also follows the coming of the Lord in the day of the Lord. So that's our summary of how Isaiah 24 and 25 relate to Revelation 19 and 20, particularly in relation to the coming of the Lord and the establishment of his kingdom and what that means for a two-stage judgment that is separated by many days. I think in doing this, we see that there is great continuity between Old Testament prophetic expectations and fulfillments that will occur in the New Testament, and in this case, with the second coming of Jesus.